For 8 years, the boy had lived inside the same walls and followed the same quiet routines. Every morning, he sat near the tall windows of the corporate estate's residential wing, pressing his hand against his right ear for just a moment before letting it drop back to his side. It looked like a habit, something automatic. He never reacted out loud, never complained, never asked for help. He simply touched his ear, blinked once, and continued whatever small task he had been given. People on the estate had learned not to pay attention. The executives and consultants came and went. The assistants and drivers kept schedules tight. Even the instructors hired to work with the child looked past the gesture, focusing instead on silent lessons and specialized training plans. The boy was expected to remain calm, compliant, and quiet enough to not disrupt the flow of business that moved around him day and night. His father, the head of the corporation, traveled constantly. When he was home, he watched his son with a kind of controlled hope, always waiting for something to change. When nothing did, he called in more help. Private physicians arrived in expensive cars, escorted through the halls like dignitaries. They examined the boy with steady hands and confident tones. They told his father the same thing each time. Nothing unexpected, nothing to be done. Reports were printed, signatures gathered, folders closed, next appointment scheduled. The cycle repeated. The estate staff updated checklists, prepared rooms, cleared hallways, and reset schedules. They heard the statements made in polished voices, condition unchanged, no improvement expected, and accepted that the silence was permanent. Conversations became short, expectations lowered. The boy touched his ear again. The domestic staff worked in the background, cleaning, carrying, organizing, keeping the environment controlled and professional. They moved through the building quietly, trained to avoid interrupting meetings or conversations. When the boy passed by, they stepped aside and bowed their heads slightly, acknowledging his presence without making a sound. The newest hire among them was still learning the estate's rhythm. She came from a small town and had taken the job because it paid well enough to cover her responsibilities outside of this place. Her uniform was crisp, her tasks straightforward. Polish surfaces, clear tables, maintain order. No one explained the boy's behavior to her. They didn't explain much at all. She was told to be efficient, respectful, invisible. From the first day, she noticed the boy's hand rising to his ear. She saw the short, controlled breath he took afterward, the way his shoulders tightened for a second and then relaxed again. But she said nothing. She continued wiping down the polished floors, folding linens, checking rows of glassware for spots. She had no reason to think anything of it. People in powerful homes had their own ways, their own histories. Sometimes, the boy would sit alone in the garden courtyard, lined with neat rows of trimmed hedges and tall stone pillars that carried the corporate emblem. Staff members passed through quickly, focused on tasks and schedules. The boy touched his ear again. The sun reflected off the windows, lighting the corporate logo behind him. His father walked through the courtyard once, speaking into a headset connected to someone miles away. He paused when he saw his son sitting there, but only for a heartbeat. He nodded at the assistant trailing him, and they continued toward the waiting car. Business demanded attention. Answers were being sought elsewhere. The consultants kept arriving. They rolled in equipment cases, unpacked devices, ran scans, and asked the boy to sit still. He obeyed. They watched monitors, exchanged quiet remarks, and packed up again. Results were always consistent. They thanked the father for his trust, promised continued support, and left the estate without altering anything in the boy's world. In the evenings, when the estate lights softened and staff voices were reduced to whispers, the boy returned to his room. He arranged small toys on a perfectly made bed. He tapped one lightly, then paused and touched his ear. No sound came from him. He simply stared forward, waiting for the next day to be the same as the last. The domestic worker passed his door during one of these quiet evenings. She paused only long enough to ensure everything appeared in order. The boy did not look at her. His fingers rested in the same place near his ear. She lowered her head and moved on. Outside, vehicles continued arriving and departing. Meetings continued late into the night in the estate's glass conference room. The father approved new appointments with specialists across the country. Plans were drafted, budgets extended, calendars rearranged. Progress was always expected but never delivered. The boy touched his ear again. The new quarter brought unfamiliar faces to the estate. Visitors in tailored suits passed through the revolving doors of the administrative wing, escorted by assistants who spoke in measured tones. Their presence shifted the rhythm of the day, though the child's behavior did not change. He continued appearing in quiet corners of the compound, touching the same place near his ear before lowering his hand again. The domestic worker wiped down glass panels near the entrance, watching reflections move behind her without turning. Large boxes labeled with logistics codes arrived some mornings, carted inside by delivery crews who were instructed not to linger. The domestic worker signed for shipments when supervisors were occupied, then returned to polishing fixtures and refilling supplies. Through open doors she glimpsed rooms set up with presentation screens, tables covered in documents, and writing boards filled with unreadable diagrams. She noticed the child seated alone near one of these rooms, hands resting on his lap, gaze fixed ahead. When a consultant walked past him without acknowledging his presence, the child touched his ear briefly and looked down. The domestic worker folded towels and kept walking. In the cafeteria reserved for internal staff, conversations stopped when external visitors entered. Forks paused mid-air, chairs adjusted quietly, and eyes shifted toward trays instead of faces. The domestic worker ate alone at a corner table, observing how the consultants spoke in firm, clipped words, as though time itself were another negotiation. Once, while clearing plates after the lunch period, she saw the child standing near the entrance door, waiting. When the father appeared a few moments later, two experts followed behind him, holding thick folders. The child took a small step forward, then paused, touching his ear before falling in line behind them. Maintenance workers updated lighting in the east corridor, rolling ladders beneath high ceilings. The domestic worker dusted bookshelves along the same hallway, occasionally pausing when she heard distant voices from conference rooms. She saw the child waiting outside one of the rooms, shoes aligned neatly, notebook balanced on his knee. Every few minutes he reached for his ear, then stilled his hand before making contact. Employees passing by nodded politely but continued on without stopping. The domestic worker adjusted the placement of books and moved on. Afternoons brought scheduled evaluations from visiting personnel. Clipboards and digital tablets circulated between offices, and staff redirected calls with brief statements that offered little clarity. The domestic worker delivered refreshments to a glass-walled meeting space, setting trays in silence. Through the transparent panels, she noticed the child tracing patterns on the table with one finger, pausing occasionally to touch his ear before returning to his quiet movements. She exited without looking back. Some consultants stayed overnight in the estate's guest suites. Their luggage arrived in black cars that idled near the porte-cochere, engines humming softly before drivers shut them off. The domestic worker laundered sheets after their departures and found notes written in careful handwriting on hotel-style stationery, listing requests and compliments. She placed each note on the supervisor's desk, then continued with her duties. On her way downstairs, she passed the child seated on a bench near the large indoor fountain. Water cascaded behind him, and the sound seemed to disappear as he pressed his fingers briefly to his ear and lowered his hand again. Evening light filtered through the wide windows of the executive lounge, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Staff moved quietly, aware that final meetings of the day were still in session. The domestic worker wiped down tables already free of dust, maintaining the appearance expected of the estate. She noticed the child sitting near the lounge entrance, a small puzzle laid out before him. Each piece clicked into place with precision, though his expression did not change. When footsteps approached, he paused, touched his ear, and placed another piece without looking up. The domestic worker continued polishing, careful not to disturb the quiet. The estate's weekly scheduling board changed again, handwritten entries replaced with typed sheets listing times and initials. The domestic worker updated linen inventories nearby, noting how new specialists were added to the rotation without comment. Outside the adjacent conference room, the child sat with his backpack resting against his legs. He flipped through a small sketchbook, turning pages slowly, fingers brushing the paper before moving to his ear and back again. When the supervisor walked past, the child closed the book, lowered his hands, and waited without speaking. The domestic worker folded the linen list and continued to the next floor. On the south terrace, potted plants were rearranged to prepare for an outdoor luncheon involving regional partners. The domestic worker carried trays of cutlery to the staging area. She saw the child walk along the covered walkway, pausing briefly when a group of visitors approached. They talked among themselves, holding tablets and pointing at building schematics, not breaking stride as they passed. The child pressed his fingertips to the side of his head, then dropped his hand and continued along the path. The domestic worker adjusted a tablecloth's edge, smoothing out invisible creases. Supervisors briefed the staff before each major meeting, reminding them of seating arrangements and protocols. The domestic worker listened from the back, taking note of which hallways to avoid during high-level discussions. After the briefing, she stepped aside to allow the father and two consultants to pass. They walked ahead with purposeful strides, papers tucked beneath their arms. A moment later, the child followed several steps behind, gaze forward, one hand occasionally rising before settling again. The domestic worker moved toward the service elevator, pushing her cleaning cart without looking back. Certain rooms were accessible only with keycards. Doors clicked open and shut throughout the afternoons, and staff were careful not to pause outside restricted areas. The domestic worker waited for an elevator with her cart when the child walked by, holding a model vehicle in his hands. He tapped its side twice, then touched his ear and kept moving down the hall. A staff member emerging from the elevator nodded at the domestic worker and moved aside so she could enter. She pressed the button without speaking. During midday breaks, lower-ranking employees gathered briefly in the staff kitchen, exchanging short remarks about workloads and schedules. The domestic worker prepared tea at the counter and overheard mentions of new consultants visiting soon, though details remained vague. The child appeared in the doorway once, looking around quietly before pressing his fingers near his ear. Staff fell silent without prompting. He walked away, and conversations resumed after a brief pause. The domestic worker finished her tea and returned to work. Late in the week, more delivery trucks arrived at the service entrance. Boxes were scanned and signed for, then carried to storage rooms by workers wearing reflective vests. The domestic worker passed through the area while collecting supplies and caught a glimpse of the child watching from a distance. His hand hovered near his ear more frequently that afternoon, though his expression stayed unchanged. A passing technician held open a door for the domestic worker, and she stepped through, returning the gesture with a nod. In the private wing of the estate, floors gleamed under soft lighting. The domestic worker polished railings while staff moved back and forth with clipboards. The child waited near the end of the hallway, seated in a chair facing a row of framed photographs. Occasionally, his head tilted slightly, and his hand drifted toward his ear before falling again to his lap. When the father emerged from an office with a cluster of specialists, the group passed the child without conversation. Their voices carried only fragments of phrases, none of which lingered. The domestic worker lowered her gaze and continued polishing. Evening approached, and the estate quieted once staff logged out and visitors departed. The domestic worker walked toward the central atrium to complete end-of-day tasks. She saw the child standing alone near the tall windows, watching the driveway where cars had come and gone throughout the week. As shadows lengthened, he raised his hand again toward his ear, paused, and lowered it, repeating the motion with practiced familiarity. She pushed her cart forward and wheeled it toward the elevator, leaving the atrium as it was, silent, orderly, unchanged. The domestic worker was assigned to the residence wing more frequently as seasonal staff rotated out. These new duties placed her in quiet hallways where the child often passed by with small objects in his hands. On her first morning in the new rotation, she found him sitting at a low bench near the rear staircase, arranging colored pencils in a straight line. He did not speak, nor look up when she walked past. But his hand rose toward his ear for a brief moment before returning to the pencils. She continued down the hall with fresh linens stacked in her arms. In the laundry room, she sorted uniforms bearing the estate's insignia while listening to muffled footsteps above. Later, while delivering folded items to designated rooms, she noticed the child standing near the corridor window, watching cars exit the grounds. He held a small notebook to his chest with both hands, fingers curled lightly over the cover. As she approached, he stepped to the side without being told, leaving space for her to pass. Their eyes did not meet, yet she offered a quiet nod, which he did not return. The gesture felt neutral rather than dismissive, and she continued without hesitation. On a day when several employees were absent, the domestic worker managed multiple tasks alone. She encountered the child in the reading nook outside the executive offices. He sat cross-legged with pages open before him, tracing lines of text with his finger. When a staff member hurried past, speaking quickly into a headset, the child touched his ear and lowered his gaze. The domestic worker set a stack of magazines on a side table, straightened their edges, and walked away as the page turned behind her. The following week, she was instructed to water the indoor greenery in the west atrium. The child appeared there mid-morning, carrying a small model of a building made of interlocking pieces. He placed it on the low marble ledge, adjusted 2 pieces, then rested his hands briefly on either side. The domestic worker filled a watering can at the nearby utility sink and moved carefully among the plants, ensuring no drops fell on the polished floor. When she finished, she passed him again. The model remained untouched, and his hand hovered once more near his ear before falling away. Staff meetings occasionally required the domestic worker to organize supplies in adjacent rooms. During one such afternoon, she stood at a cart filled with stationery when the child approached the doorway and paused. He did not enter, only watched quietly as she rearranged papers and capped ink bottles. When she reached for a stack of envelopes on a high shelf, she felt the slight movement of air as he stepped back to create more space. She nodded once without speaking, and he nodded back, the motion subtle and brief. That small pause lingered in the air before he walked away, hand brushing his ear only after the doorway no longer framed him. Toward the end of the month, the domestic worker was assigned to restock supplies in the child's study area. The room was quiet, with sunlight filtering through large windows and notebooks arranged in even rows. She placed sharpened pencils in a wooden holder and refilled a drawer with unused paper. The child entered without announcement, holding a small toy car with both hands. He placed it on the edge of the desk and rolled it back and forth once, the wheels turning silently. The domestic worker stepped aside to allow him space, and he nodded again, slightly, briefly, before focusing on the car. She exited without turning her head. On another morning, she passed the child in the courtyard corridor while carrying folded towels for the guest suites. He walked slowly, counting steps under his breath, though the words were too quiet to distinguish. She paused to adjust her grip on the towels, and he paused as well, maintaining distance. His gaze moved to the floor, then to the large windows that reflected the estate grounds. One hand rose toward his ear, then dropped again. She resumed her pace, and he resumed his, their paths diverging without a word. Rain fell steadily one afternoon, and staff were instructed to use indoor routes only. The domestic worker rolled a cart of supplies toward the central gallery, where framed images lined the walls. She saw the child seated on a cushioned bench, sketchbook open across his knees. He held a pencil lightly, drawing short, careful strokes. When he noticed her approaching, he shifted slightly to give her space to pass. She paused to adjust a crooked frame on the wall, checked her cart, and moved on without speaking. As she rounded the corner, the faint sound of pencil on paper continued behind her. During a scheduled cleaning of the fitness wing, the domestic worker carried fresh towels through the narrow hallway. The child stood near the vending machines, looking through the glass at the rows of drinks and snacks. His hand hovered near the selection panel before he stepped back, pressing his fingers to his ear for a brief moment. She placed the towels on a shelf, turned, and offered a small wave. He returned it with a slight lift of his hand, then lowered his gaze to the machines again. She left the wing without another gesture. The domestic worker received a new assignment that required reorganizing storage cabinets in the recreational room. As she worked, she heard soft footsteps and glanced over her shoulder. The child stood just inside the doorway, holding a puzzle box. He did not speak, only placed the box on a nearby table and opened it carefully. Pieces spilled out in muted colors, and he began sorting them by edge and shape. She continued stacking board games on a high shelf, mindful of their placement. When she turned back, he paused, looked at the puzzle piece in his hand, and then at her. She nodded once, and he resumed sorting. No words passed between them. Later that week, a brief power interruption caused lights to flicker throughout the building. The domestic worker was polishing the banister on the main staircase when she noticed the child standing halfway up the steps, holding a small notebook. As the lights steadied again, he tapped the notebook's spine with his thumb, then touched his ear before lowering his hand. She stepped aside to allow him space on the staircase. He passed slowly, keeping one hand lightly on the banister. When he reached the landing, he paused, glanced back, and gave a slow nod. She acknowledged him with a similar nod, then returned to polishing. In the residence kitchen, staff prepared trays for an internal luncheon. The domestic worker restocked plates and utensils in silence while conversations murmured around her. The child appeared at the doorway holding a folded piece of paper. He hesitated before entering, then placed the paper on a side counter near a stack of napkins. The domestic worker stopped wiping a surface long enough to nod. He nodded back, lifted the same piece of paper, folded it more neatly, and set it down again before walking out. She continued her task, keeping the counters clear and utensils aligned. On a quiet morning, the domestic worker tended to plants in the courtyard atrium. The sounds of distant conversation filtered through the glass walls. The child stood near the base of a tall indoor tree, balancing a book on his palm. When she walked past with a watering can, he shifted slightly, opening the book to reveal pages filled with drawings and lines of text. He did not show it to her, only held it steady. She paused, adjusted her grip on the watering can, and nodded. He closed the book softly, pressed one hand near his ear, and walked toward the hallway. She watered the next plant without turning. The month continued with subtle changes in assignment schedules. The domestic worker was instructed to supervise the replenishing of art supplies in the activity room. As she arranged materials, the child entered carrying a small wooden box. He placed it on the table, slid open the lid, and took out a handful of colored pieces. She stepped back to give him space, observing how he lined the pieces in a row without interruption. When she reached for additional supplies, their hands briefly hovered near the same spot before she pulled back. He nodded once in acknowledgement, then resumed aligning the pieces. She finished arranging the shelves, waited for an appropriate pause, and left without a word. Over time, the domestic worker's routine expanded to include tasks closer to the child's study spaces. She dusted low bookshelves, straightened writing tools, and replaced worn cloths on desks. Each visit brought the same brief sight, the child's hand rising toward his ear, pausing as though reconsidering, then lowering again. She noticed this while folding blankets near the reading corner, stacking sketchbooks, wiping clean surfaces, always in silence. The motion repeated often enough to register, yet no directive suggested she mention it, and no one else seemed to observe as they passed through with documents, tablets, or hurried steps. On mornings when consultants arrived early, the domestic worker prepared the lounge with water pitchers and polished glasses. She saw the child seated near the wide windows, notebook balanced against his knees. His hand drifted toward his ear more frequently on those days, though his face remained calm. When staff crossed between him and the light coming through the windows, he paused mid-motion until the path cleared, then rested his hands on the notebook again. The domestic worker moved quietly around him, adjusting pillows without disturbing the air. She glanced once at the small shift in his posture, then immediately lowered her gaze to her work. One afternoon, she was assigned to organize office supplies near a staff meeting room. Voices rose and fell behind the frosted glass, though she could not distinguish individual words. The child sat outside the room with a spiral-bound pad on his lap, holding a pencil loosely. Every few moments, he lifted his hand halfway to his ear before catching himself and placing it flat against his thigh. The domestic worker arranged boxes of staples and pens, aligning them by size. With each turn back to the shelves, she saw the repeated motion. She smoothed the sides of the boxes with her palm and continued working, hearing the faint hum of conversation behind the door. The next day, the domestic worker replaced linens in guest suites. As she moved a cart along the corridor, she noticed the child waiting alone near a framed map of the estate. His shoulders rose slightly with his breath. His hand hovered but did not touch. When a staff member hurried by carrying a laptop, the child lowered his hand and straightened his posture as though bracing himself. The domestic worker passed with folded sheets in her arms, slowing just enough to steady the cart without stopping. She caught the brief motion again, the fingertips near the ear, before turning into the suite. During weekly maintenance checks, the domestic worker accompanied a supervisor to verify room readiness. In a hallway lined with abstract artwork, they encountered the child standing near a console table where decorative items were carefully arranged. The supervisor asked a question regarding supply inventory, and the domestic worker answered quietly. As they spoke, the child shifted his weight, hand rising briefly near his ear before resting again at his side. The domestic worker finished her sentence, received instructions for the next task, and followed the supervisor past the child. She did not look back. In the recreation wing, where employees occasionally gathered after hours, the domestic worker was tasked with rearranging storage cabinets. Midway through folding blankets, she paused when she noticed the child standing near the far corner, his face turned slightly away. He lifted his hand, fingers resting against the edge of his ear for a second longer than usual. His eyes closed briefly, then opened again. The domestic worker watched long enough to register the movement, then lowered her gaze to the blankets, refolding them with measured care. When she looked up again, he had stepped toward the doorway, hands now clasped in front of him. Late in the week, as staff prepared for executive travel, the domestic worker cleaned the private lounge. The child waited near the entrance, backpack on one shoulder, notebook clasped tightly with both hands. The gesture toward his ear came more quickly now, as if responding to something unseen. She paused in her polishing, cloth resting on the arm of a chair, and watched the motion repeat with quiet regularity. A staff member called her name from down the hall, breaking her focus. She folded the cloth neatly, placed it in her cart, and followed the call without hesitation, leaving the lounge unchanged. Clouds gathered over the estate one afternoon, and the domestic worker was assigned to refresh the linens in the main residence before an evening gathering. While moving down the hallway with a stack of folded towels, she saw the child standing alone near the glass doors that opened toward the courtyard. His hand lifted toward his ear and hovered there, just long enough to give the motion weight before dropping again. She slowed her steps to avoid startling him, then continued past without speaking, adjusting the towels to keep them aligned. In the upper wing, the domestic worker dusted the framed photographs lining a narrow corridor. The child appeared at the far end, holding a small wooden box. He walked slowly toward her, pausing every few steps as though listening for something she could not hear. His hand rose toward his ear, then lowered again before he reached her. She stepped aside to give him space, and he continued down the hall. As she wiped the final frame, she caught a faint reflection of his gesture in the polished glass before folding her cloth and returning it to the cart. During supply restocking in the art room, she opened cabinets filled with paints, brushes, and paper. The child entered moments later, placing a stack of blank pages on a table without a word. He pressed his fingers to his ear, lowered his hand, and began arranging the pages into a neat pile. The domestic worker continued placing jars of paint in ordered rows, aware of his presence without looking directly at him. When she finished and reached for the door, she hesitated briefly, sensing the repeated motion even without seeing it. She stepped out quietly, closing the door halfway behind her. One morning, The domestic worker passed through the lobby where a group of consultants conversed with estate managers. She kept her gaze forward, aware that lingering might draw attention. Near the elevator bank, the child stood with a small charm in his hand, thumb tracing its surface. As voices rose in the background, he lifted his hand toward his ear, held still, then lowered it. The elevator doors opened, and people stepped out, causing him to move aside. The domestic worker walked past the scene, careful not to interrupt the steady flow of movement around her. Later in the week, she prepared a guest suite for a last-minute arrival. The child stood beneath the archway leading to the suite's private garden, turning a pen between his fingers. His hand drifted upward toward his ear before he noticed her approach. He paused, lowered the pen, and stepped aside. The domestic worker placed folded blankets at the foot of the bed, smoothed the cover, and adjusted the pillows. When she left the room, he was still standing in the archway, gaze unfixed, hand resting near the side of his head as though waiting for something familiar. During an inventory check in the East Wing storage room, the domestic worker marked items on a clipboard while staff voices echoed faintly through the corridor. She stepped into the hallway and saw the child seated on a bench, notebook open, pencil tapping rhythmically against the page. His hand rose toward his ear at the sound of footsteps, then dropped once the corridor quieted again. She passed him slowly, acknowledging the stillness without breaking it, then continued toward the elevator. Late on a quiet afternoon, a sudden gust of wind rattled the courtyard glass. The domestic worker paused near the vestibule, holding a replacement light bulb. The child stood near the main staircase, backpack hanging loosely from one shoulder. His hand rose toward his ear again, more frequently now, as staff moved around him preparing for upcoming appointments. She watched for a moment, then resumed walking, replacing the light bulb before returning to her cart. As she checked her list of remaining tasks, the gesture repeated behind her. Unspoken, unchanged, unanswered. A sharp cry from the courtyard hallway cut through the late afternoon quiet, stopping the domestic worker mid-step as she carried a stack of folded uniforms toward the laundry room. She turned instinctively, unsure whether she had misheard. But the sound came again, brief, strained, then swallowed by silence. She set the uniforms on the nearest table and followed the echo through the corridor, her pace steady but urgent enough to reach the source without drawing attention. Near the glass doors leading to the courtyard, she found the child seated on the tiled floor, hunched forward with both hands pressed firmly against his ear. His backpack lay open beside him, notebooks scattered. He rocked slightly, shoulders trembling with silent effort. The domestic worker knelt nearby, not touching him at first, only lowering herself to his level. When his shaking eased enough for him to draw breath, she placed one hand gently on the ground to steady herself, the other hovering near his shoulder before resting lightly to let him know she was present. The child's breathing hitched again, and he pressed his palm harder against his ear, eyes squeezed shut as though blocking out something unseen. The domestic worker reached into her apron pocket with a slow, controlled motion, producing a carefully wrapped cloth that she'd folded earlier for unrelated tasks. She held it where he could see, waiting. When his gaze flickered toward her hand, she gave a single nod. He hesitated, fingers slipping slightly as he lowered his hand from his ear, revealing flushed skin and a shallow indentation where pressure had been applied. Without speaking, she unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small, sterilized tool, something she had kept nearby after days of quiet uncertainty. She paused long enough to let the moment settle, then lifted the tool toward his ear with a steady hand. The child sat rigid, eyes fixed on a point beyond the hallway as though preparing himself. She worked slowly, adjusting her angle to avoid casting a shadow that might obscure what she needed to see. At first there was nothing unusual, only the faint outline of the inner ear. Then she angled the tool slightly, and something dark shifted into view. Her breath caught, but she did not stop. With precise motions, she eased the tool forward, careful not to cause harm. The child flinched, but did not pull away. She anchored her free hand against the floor for balance, applied steady pressure, and withdrew just as something small and dark loosened. It resisted, then gave way with a soft, muffled release. She cupped her palm beneath the tool, catching what fell free. The courtyard lights flickered once as a cloud passed overhead, and in that dimming the child inhaled sharply. His hand flew to his ear, not in pain but as if something new had arrived in place of what had gone. The domestic worker remained kneeling, object still resting in her palm, waiting for the next breath to come. The courtyard hallway remained still, broken only by the child's uneven breaths. He lowered his hand from his ear and blinked rapidly, as though adjusting to something unfamiliar. The domestic worker stayed kneeling, keeping the object contained in her palm without looking directly at it. Her other hand rested lightly on the floor for balance. The child lifted his head, eyes darting around the space, scanning surfaces he had seen countless times before as though noticing them with new urgency. A distant vibration echoed through the corridor, air moving through the ventilation system. The child's head turned sharply, gaze fixed in the direction of the faint hum. His lips parted, but no sound left them. He rose to his knees slowly, one hand bracing against the floor, the other hovering near his ear but not touching. The domestic worker shifted back enough to give him room, keeping her movements small and measured. Footsteps sounded from a nearby staircase, distant but unmistakable. The child straightened and looked toward the railing with sudden focus. His eyes widened, tracking the rhythm of the steps before the person appeared. A staff member passed through the hallway, tapping a pen against a notebook with steady rhythm. The child stiffened, gaze following the motion. The staff member noticed neither of them, offering only a brief nod as they continued onward. When the sound of footsteps faded, the child released a breath he seemed to have been holding. With cautious movements, the domestic worker stood and placed the wrapped cloth around the object in her palm, concealing it without attempting to pocket or discard it. She held it with both hands in front of her, as though awaiting instruction that would never come. The child rose to his feet, shoulders tense, eyes alert. He looked past her toward the far end of the corridor, where a maintenance cart rolled slowly across the floor, its wheels clicking with each rotation. His gaze followed the sound until the cart turned a corner and disappeared. He took a hesitant step forward, then stopped. The domestic worker positioned herself slightly behind him, maintaining enough distance to avoid leading. The child raised his hand once more, fingertips brushing lightly against the side of his head. Instead of a press or a wince, the gesture lingered, uncertain. His hand fell to his side, and he took another step, slower than before. A breeze drifted in from the open courtyard door, rustling papers stacked on a nearby table. The edges fluttered gently, and the child turned toward the sound, watching the motion of the sheets as though following something invisible. He stood still, listening, then brought his fingers to his throat, resting them there without pressing. The domestic worker observed without speaking, her posture steady, the wrapped object held firmly in her hands. The child's shoulders rose with a deep breath, and he exhaled as though testing the space around him. His gaze traveled along the corridor walls, following shapes and lines that had never drawn his attention before. He looked toward the domestic worker, eyes steady, as if expecting confirmation or guidance. She offered neither, only a small nod acknowledging presence, not meaning. Without warning, he turned toward the courtyard door, stepping into the open air. The domestic worker followed a few paces behind, watching as he paused beneath the overhang. Leaves rustled on nearby branches, and the child's head lifted slightly, gaze tracing the movement. He lifted his hand halfway, then let it fall. The domestic worker remained at the threshold, the wrapped object secure in her grasp. No words were exchanged. The air felt different, but nothing had been named. The morning after the courtyard incident, the estate felt unusually alert. Staff moved with clipped efficiency, voices lowered as though anticipating instructions not yet given. The domestic worker arrived early, placing her bag in the staff locker room before collecting her cleaning cart. She checked her schedule on the bulletin board. No changes listed. Yet an unspoken tension lingered in the air. The wrapped object remained inside a drawer in her quarters, untouched since the afternoon before, though her thoughts returned to it without prompting. As she pushed her cart down the corridor, she noticed the child standing near the long window that overlooked the fountain. He held a pencil loosely, spinning it between his fingers. His gaze tracked something outside: birds landing near the water, the swaying branches, the movements of distant groundskeepers. When a leaf scraped across the stone path outside, carried by a faint breeze, his head turned abruptly toward the sound. The domestic worker paused for half a breath before continuing her route, careful not to linger. Before she reached the end of the corridor, a supervisor signaled her into a side office. The door closed behind her with a muted click. A polished wood desk separated them, papers spread neatly across its surface. The supervisor gestured to a chair, and the domestic worker sat with her hands clasped to avoid fidgeting. The supervisor reviewed a file briefly before looking up, their expression firm. Questions followed, indirect at first, then increasingly pointed, about procedures, proximity to the child, interactions outside assigned tasks. The domestic worker responded respectfully and briefly, her voice steady and without elaboration. When asked whether she had handled anything related to the child's condition, she shook her head once. The supervisor's pen hovered over the file, then tapped lightly against the margin. She was dismissed with a nod, the lack of closure palpable. Word spread quietly among the staff. Conversations paused when she approached. Voices resumed only after she passed. In the cafeteria, chairs scraped softly against the floor as employees repositioned themselves to avoid direct eye contact. She ate her meal in silence, finishing quickly before returning her tray. Near the exit, two housekeepers whispered to each other, sentences truncated as she stepped through the doorway. She did not turn her head. In the afternoon, executives and consultants convened in the West Lounge. The father stood at the center of the room, speaking in low tones to those gathered around him. The domestic worker passed through with a tray of refreshments, eyes downcast. As she approached the table, she heard fragments of conversation, phrases referencing protocol, access, and boundaries, though none were directed at her. A consultant glanced her way, eyebrows tightening as though recognizing her face from memory. She set the tray down carefully, aligning each glass before stepping back. The father's gaze rested on her for a moment, unreadable. She lowered her eyes and exited without looking up. Later, while polishing the banister in the main hall, she saw the child walking several steps behind a staff member carrying folders. The staff member spoke briskly, unaware of the child's attention shifting towards sounds rather than movements. The child paused mid-step as distant voices echoed from a nearby conference room. His hand rose halfway toward his ear, then fell to his side again. The staff member called his name sharply, mistaking the pause for distraction. The child blinked, nodded once, and continued walking. The domestic worker kept polishing, hands steady, muscles still. By late afternoon, supervisors conducted an unannounced inspection of common areas. Two of them stopped near the domestic worker's cart, exchanging clipped observations about recent concerns. Their voices were level but cool, carrying enough weight to reach nearby staff. The domestic worker listened without responding, hands folded behind her back. When questioned again about her adherence to duties, she answered with brief confirmations and nothing more. The supervisors exchanged glances before walking away, leaving the air heavy with implications that as she prepared to store her cart for the day, she noticed the child sitting alone near the indoor garden. His posture was different, more upright, shoulders set back, yet his hands remained still in his lap. He looked toward a flickering light panel overhead, eyes narrowing slightly as though adjusting to a faint hum. The domestic worker paused at the threshold, but a supervisor appeared behind her and cleared their throat. She moved forward immediately, placing the cart in its designated space. When she exited the storage room, she saw the father speaking with two consultants at the far end of the hall. His expression was stern, gestures controlled. One consultant gestured toward a clipboard containing notes from recent visits, tapping a particular line with insistence. The father shook his head once, eyes fixed on the paper. The domestic worker hesitated, waiting for the group to pass before continuing toward the service elevator. As she walked, She caught a glimpse of the child turning toward the sound of their voices, attentive but silent. The elevator doors closed around her, muting the estate's sounds. She stood with hands clasped, recalling the way the child's head turned toward noises that had once gone unnoticed. Yet she remained silent, just as the hierarchy expected. The elevator chimed, doors opening to another quiet floor where her tasks remained unchanged. No acknowledgement was given, no clarification offered, no shift occurred. The object stayed hidden, the gesture lingered, and the estate continued moving around her as though nothing had happened. A week later, the estate received a series of sealed envelopes delivered through the administrative entrance. The domestic worker noticed them only in passing, stacked neatly on a trolley escorted by 2 staff members wearing visitor badges. Their expressions were neutral, focused, as though the weight of the envelopes extended beyond paper. She continued polishing the brass fixtures near the lobby, observing how the trolley was guided past restricted doors and into the conference wing without pause. Moments later, the child appeared near the stairway, adjusting the strap of his backpack as he followed the envelopes with a measured gaze. His hand rose toward his ear, lingering for a beat before falling away. That afternoon, the domestic worker was asked to refresh the executive lounge in preparation for a private review session. She wiped down surfaces, aligned chairs, and placed bottles of water at precise intervals on the long table. Outside the lounge, she overheard hushed voices, phrases referencing dates, signatures, previous appointments. When she stepped aside to let a group enter, she saw one of the consultants from earlier weeks carry a portfolio thicker than before. The father walked behind them, eyes sharp, holding a set of documents stapled at the top. The domestic worker lowered her gaze and exited. In the hallway, she paused briefly near the window, watching as the child lingered outside the lounge door. He stood still, listening, not with hands pressed to his ear, but simply watching the movement of shadows beyond the frosted glass. The domestic worker passed him with her cart, slowing only enough to steady a stack of cloth napkins. He did not turn his head toward her, but his posture shifted slightly, as though bracing for something he could not name. The door opened abruptly, and a supervisor beckoned her inside to refill a tray. She entered quietly. The documents now lay open across the table, arranged in neat rows. The father remained seated, elbows resting on the polished surface, scanning highlighted pages. The consultant stood behind him, gesturing toward charts and lists of past observations, appointment summaries, assessment results, handwritten notes from specialists who had visited months or years prior. The domestic worker noted the repetition of signatures, same names recurring across different dates, before stepping back through the door with her tray. Later, near the archives room in the administrative wing, she saw boxes labeled with past evaluation cycles. 2 staff members carried them into the same lounge, whispering about misplaced files and incomplete follow-ups. One mentioned a missed appointment. Another referenced an outdated record that had been unclearly documented. The domestic worker kept her eyes down, pushing her cart toward the elevator. As the elevator doors closed, she glimpsed the child sitting on a bench nearby, notebook open but untouched, as though waiting. The following morning, photocopies appeared in the staff kitchen, accidentally left behind or deliberately forgotten. The domestic worker did not touch them but read the headers. Names of clinics, signatures repeating across years, summaries with identical phrases. In the margin of one document, she recognized the handwriting of a specialist who had visited recently, identical to a note from years before. A colleague hurried in, gathered the papers with flushed cheeks, and left without comment. The domestic worker resumed rinsing her cup, the sound of water masking the quick footsteps behind her. Throughout the day, the estate hummed with activity. Workers rolled carts stacked with folders, whispering about deadlines and upcoming sessions. The child walked the halls with uncommon focus, pausing near staff rooms where conversations halted mid-sentence. He touched his ear only once, in the midst of overlapping voices, then lowered his hand as though confirming something internally. The domestic worker continued her tasks without altering her rhythm. Late in the afternoon, A consulting team arrived carrying portable equipment previously unseen in the estate. They spoke to the father in low tones, referencing old reports and new findings. The domestic worker brought refreshments, placing glasses quietly along the table's edge. A consultant adjusted a display screen showing past evaluations in chronological order, revealing gaps where follow-ups should have been. The father leaned forward, scanning the timeline with furrowed brows, lips pressed into a thin line. The domestic worker stepped back without comment, her hands steady at her sides. As she exited the room, she caught a glimpse of the child at the far end of the hall, his attention drawn to faint sounds echoing through the corridor. The clink of glass, the shuffle of papers, the low hum of machinery powering on. He did not blink. The domestic worker continued walking, allowing the moment to pass without acknowledgement. The next day began with a quiet urgency. Couriers arrived at the administrative gates before sunrise, delivering additional files sealed with tamper-evident tape. The domestic worker watched from the lobby as staff signed for each package, logging serial numbers before transporting them to the executive wing on rolling carts. She did not follow but continued dusting the display shelves, her cloth moving slowly over framed certificates. When she turned, she saw the child standing near the staircase landing, his eyes fixed on the carts as they disappeared around the corner. His hand hovered near his ear for the briefest moment before dropping again. Later that morning, the domestic worker was instructed to prepare refreshments for a continuation session. In the meeting room, unfamiliar devices sat beside large binders stamped with clinic seals. As she placed water bottles on a side table, she noticed a document spread open near the father. Its typeface matched records she had glimpsed in the kitchen a day earlier. Repeated conclusions, duplicated phrases, identical summaries across different years. Signatures aligned from page to page, small variations in handwriting revealing long intervals between visits. She did not linger, but her eyes caught the same signature twice on consecutive sheets before she stepped out of the room. In the hallway, she passed two administrators reviewing a printed checklist. They spoke quietly but clearly enough for fragments to carry: backlogged, cross-checking, incomplete follow-up, previous assumptions. One administrator flipped through a binder, frowning as they compared entries from different dates. The domestic worker paused to adjust her cleaning supplies, allowing them to move past. When she continued, she saw the child near the gallery entrance, notebook open but pencil motionless in his fingers. He looked toward the closed meeting room door, listening to muffled voices through the walls. Midday, the faculty dining area was unusually still. A staff member whispered that the father had requested privacy for ongoing consultations. The domestic worker retrieved a tray of dishes from the lounge, noticing how conversations halted whenever someone passed by with documents. Through open doors, she glimpsed pages projected onto screens, named dates highlighted in fluorescent colors, and arrows drawn between matching evaluations separated by years. Consultants leaned in, conferring quietly, while the father stood at the head of the table, arms folded tightly across his chest. The domestic worker returned to the elevator, careful not to glance back. In the mid-afternoon, a door to the archive room was left slightly ajar. The domestic worker approached with a feather duster and paused. Inside, two staff members compared boxes labeled with overlapping years, removing folders and placing them in rows on the floor. One pointed to a form, tapping its header, while the other shook their head and noted something on a clipboard. The domestic worker dusted the doorframe without stepping inside. When she turned away, she saw the child seated on a padded bench, notebook resting unopened across his lap. His posture was still alert, as though waiting. As the day progressed, the estate's soundscape shifted. Printers hummed continuously, scanners beeped, and pages rustled with increasing speed. The domestic worker polished surfaces in the executive wing, moving between rooms as instructed. She did not intrude, but each time she passed the glass-walled office, she saw more papers laid out in spreading circles. Reports aligned side by side, annotations marking repeated conclusions, diagrams showing patterns she could not fully read. The father paced slowly behind the displays, stopping only to place a hand against the edge of a binder, his expression distant. In the late afternoon, she was sent to deliver additional notepads to the same room. When she entered, she noticed a new document clipped to a stack, an assessment summary from early in the child's life, containing a notation almost identical to recent entries. A consultant tapped the page gently, drawing the father's attention to 3 matching sentences across multiple years. No one spoke for several seconds. The domestic worker placed the notepads as requested and stepped back. The air felt heavier, though nothing had been said aloud. On her way out, she passed the child standing near the door. His gaze lingered on the open binders resting on the table, then shifted to the distant view outside the window as though comparing the two silently. He did not raise his hand to his ear, but his breathing deepened, shoulders rising with a quiet steadiness. The domestic worker paused only long enough to acknowledge his presence with a slight nod. He did not return it, his focus anchored elsewhere. As she continued down the hall, the soft murmur of voices resumed behind the closing door. The papers remained spread across the table, unchanged in arrangement yet carrying new weight. Nothing was stated, yet something had shifted, quietly, without confirmation, without conclusion. The following morning, the estate moved with a quieter precision. Staff walked more deliberately, avoiding unnecessary conversations, as though waiting for instructions already understood but not spoken aloud. The domestic worker began her duties in the executive lounge, polishing surfaces that had been cleared of documents the night before. She noticed small traces left behind, indentations on the wood where binders had rested, faint marks from highlighters near the waste bin, a paperclip on the carpet. These signs remained without commentary, silently confirming the previous day's activity. When she exited the lounge, she saw the father standing near the long window overlooking the courtyard. His hands rested at his sides, shoulders lowered in a way she had not seen before. The child stood a short distance away, facing the same window. Their postures mirrored one another, still, steady, attentive. A faint sound reached them from outside, a gardener moving a rake across gravel, the metal scraping rhythmically. The child's head turned toward the sound, and the father's gaze followed. For the first time, the domestic worker saw the father watching his son's reaction without confusion or doubt. She walked past them slowly, pushing her cart toward the service elevator. Behind her, she heard the father speak the child's name, not sharply or urgently, but with clarity. The child turned, eyes meeting his father's. No further words followed, yet the space between them held a quiet recognition, understanding without elaboration. The domestic worker continued down the hall, maintaining her pace, but the steady rhythm of footsteps felt subtly different now, as though the building itself exhaled. Later, she was instructed to deliver a set of neatly organized binders to the archive room. As she placed them on the designated shelf, she noticed that several folders had already been returned and labeled with new dates. Their placement confirmed a process completed rather than delayed. Nothing was said about what had been discovered or by whom, but the order of the shelves told its own story. Past entries aligned, inconsistencies corrected, missing follow-ups now present. Returning to the main corridor, she saw the child walking beside the father. Their steps were measured, not hurried. The child paused near a wall where a framed photograph hung slightly askew, and the father adjusted it with a firm, quiet motion before they continued together. In the afternoon, the domestic worker was called to the administrative wing to reset a meeting room that had already been cleared of papers and screens. Chairs were arranged in even rows, nameplates removed, surfaces wiped free of notes. As she straightened the final chair, she noticed a single sheet left on the table. A clean summary page bearing signatures from multiple dates, all now organized in consistent order. The handwriting she had seen repeated across years appeared again, this time beside the child's most recent entry. She folded the page into a folder left for that purpose and placed it on the return cart without pause. Outside the room, the father stood near an alcove where soft light filtered across the floor. The child was beside him, holding a small notebook. Neither spoke. The domestic worker passed quietly, head bowed, but she saw the father lay his hand briefly on the notebook's cover as if acknowledging its presence rather than directing its use. The child looked up at him and nodded once, a motion mirrored by the father before both faced forward again. As the domestic worker continued her tasks, she crossed paths with staff moving equipment back to storage. Cases closed, wires coiled, labels updated. No hushed voices followed her this time. No conversations shifted when she approached. In the cafeteria, workers sat in their usual places, speaking in ordinary tones. When she entered, silence did not fall. Someone lifted a hand in greeting. She returned the gesture and took a seat by the window, finishing her meal without interruption before collecting her tray. Later, she was assigned to the courtyard foyer, sweeping debris blown in by the afternoon wind. Through the wide glass doors, she saw the child and father walk along the path that circled the fountain. Leaves rustled beneath their feet, and birds shifted on the branches overhead. Each time a sound crossed their path, a distant car, a gardener's shovel striking stone, the soft clatter of a cart being wheeled across tiles. The child turned his head with steady focus. The father matched his pace, observing without stepping ahead. The domestic worker paused her sweeping long enough to let the sight settle in her awareness. Then she continued her work, drawing the broom across the floor in long, quiet strokes while the pair moved beyond the gate and out of view. Nothing was said, yet everything that needed acknowledgement had been seen.